This is the sound of an assassin. Wait, no, wrong movie. This is the sound of an assassin. Shish shish bam. Hey guys, welcome to another episode of The Faithful Journey, where we bring you the most exciting stories from the most unlikely heroes of the Bible. And today, we're going to tell you the story of Ehud, a man who was considered weak because he was left-handed, but ended up being the strongest man in Israel because of it. So let's begin. It all started when Israel did something they shouldn't have done. They sinned against God, and he gave them over to their enemies, the Moabites, so that they would be oppressed for 18 years. And not just any Moabites, mind you, but King Eglon, who was described as really nasty and fat, like morbidly obese. We'll get to that in a minute. But first, let's talk about Ehud, because he's a character. He was a left-handed judge who lived in the time of the oppression of Moab. Now, if you were a left-handed person living in the time of Ehud, you would have had a pretty rough life. See, back then, most people were right-handed, and this gave them a distinct advantage over their left-handed counterparts, because all the tools were made for right-handed people. And since there was a lack of understanding of how the other 10% functioned, they were often ridiculed and looked down upon. Imagine, if you will, a world without can openers or corkscrews that were designed for lefties. In other words, a world that was pretty much designed to make your life difficult. That was the case for Ehud, but it also meant that he was underestimated by everyone, especially the enemy. In fact, when Ehud approached King Eglon to deliver a message from God, he was laughed out of the palace. Why? Because he was left-handed. King Eglon probably thought to himself, a left-handed messenger of God? No way. But this wasn't just some small-time bully that we're talking about. We're talking about the king of Moab, a man who had been oppressing Israel for 18 years. And not just oppressing them, mind you, but ruling over them with an iron fist. There's also the small detail that he was described as having thick fat around his loins, which probably means that he wasn't exactly the most athletic person. And yet, it was this man who stood between Israel and their freedom. And it seemed like there was no way to defeat him. I mean, who could possibly defeat a fat king who ruled with an iron fist and had an entire army at his command? It would take someone special, someone who was willing to do what no one else could, someone who was willing to become an instrument of God's judgment. And that someone was Ehud, the left-handed judge. See, God had a plan for Ehud. He had been preparing him for this moment his entire life. And now it was time for him to step up and do what only he could do. Now, this wasn't going to be easy, mind you. Taking out a king was no easy feat, especially a king as powerful and dangerous as Eglon. But Ehud was up for the task. He had a plan, and he was going to stick to it. Meanwhile, King Eglon was enjoying a nice, relaxing day in his palace, when suddenly the doors burst open, and Ehud walked in. Now, normally, this wouldn't have been anything out of the ordinary. After all, the king received visitors all the time. But there was something about Ehud that made the king uneasy. He couldn't put his finger on it, but something about the way he carried himself, the way he looked at him, it just didn't sit right with him. Try as he might to shake off these uneasy feelings, they just wouldn't go away. He tried to focus on the message that Ehud had supposedly come to deliver, but he couldn't help but feel like something was off. As Ehud continued speaking, the king's unease only grew until he could take it no longer. He stopped Ehud and told him to leave. Ehud was stunned. He had never been thrown out of a king's court before, let alone by a king as powerful and dangerous as Eglon. But he wasn't about to give up. He had come too far to turn back now, so he did the only thing he could think of. He turned around and walked out of the palace, but not without making sure that King Eglon saw him walk away. As he did, he couldn't help but smile to himself. The king may have thrown him out of the palace, but he had the last laugh. The next day, however, the king's mood had changed. He was furious, and he wanted answers. He sent his men out to find Ehud and bring him back to the palace, dead or alive. The men searched high and low, but they couldn't find Ehud anywhere. He had vanished without a trace. The king was even more furious now. He had been made a fool of, and he wasn't going to stand for it. He assembled his army and set out to find Ehud, determined to make an example of him. Meanwhile, Ehud was hiding out in the wilderness, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He knew that the king was after him, but he wasn't afraid. He trusted in God to protect him, and when the time was right, he would make his move. Days turned into weeks, and the king's search party came up empty-handed. He had to return to the palace, defeated and humiliated. Now, back in the palace, the king was pacing back and forth, his eyes flashing with anger and determination. He had failed to capture Ehud, and he was desperate to restore his honor. Then he had an idea. He would hold a feast in his palace and invite all the nobles from neighboring kingdoms. He would show them that despite his failure to capture Ehud, he was still a powerful and respected king. The king sent out invitations, and soon the palace was filled with nobles from all over the region. They ate, they drank, and they celebrated, all while the king watched over them, seething with barely contained anger. All the while, Ehud was watching from the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He knew that if he could take out the king in front of all those nobles, it would be a humiliating defeat for Moab, and it would inspire the people of Israel to rise up and fight back against their oppressors. Finally, the moment was right. As the feast was coming to an end, Ehud made his move. He slipped into the palace unnoticed and made his way to the king's throne room. There he found the king sitting surrounded by his nobles, and this was the moment Ehud had been waiting for. With a sword in hand, he charged forward and plunged the blade deep into the king's heart. The nobles were stunned. They watched in disbelief as the king's eyes widened in surprise, and then he collapsed to the ground, dead. And that's how Ehud became the hero of Israel. He had taken out the most powerful man in Moab and delivered his people from oppression. The nobles were so shocked by Ehud's bravery that they fled the palace, leaving Ehud and the dead king behind. Ehud wasted no time. He grabbed the king's crown and held it aloft, declaring himself the new ruler of Moab. The people of Israel were overjoyed. For the first time in 18 years, they could raise their heads up high and be proud. Under Ehud's leadership, they won many battles against their oppressors, and eventually they were able to drive them out of their land altogether. Israel was free once more, and all because of a man who was considered weak by his contemporaries. What does the story of Ehud teach us? It teaches us that God can use anyone to accomplish his purposes. It doesn't matter if you're left-handed, right-handed, black, white, male, female, young, old, rich, poor, educated, or uneducated. If God calls you, he will equip you for the task. He will give you the strength and the skills you need to succeed. Don't ever doubt that God can use you. And don't ever underestimate the power of the seemingly weak. Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed the story of Ehud as much as we enjoyed bringing it to you. If you want to know more about the Bible, but you don't know where to start, why not try starting here?